All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Quinn. I run our infrastructure and our content team over at BlackRock. And Pat?
Good morning, everyone. Pat McCoy. I lead Mandiant's managed validation team. I've been with Mandiant about 7 years, led their red team for 6.5 of those, and now help customers get better at detecting, defending, and alerting against threat actor activity.
Fantastic. Got it. I figured out the toughest part of the technology today, so we're in good shape. All right, so I just kind of wanted to start out and basically say, you know, we all have the exact same problems that we're kind of dealing with these days. We all have an influx of tools, a lack of resources, and endless threat intelligence that we are all trying to combine together in different ways to make our organization successful. So one of the things that we constantly are dealing with is how do you take all of these different things? How do you take these problems that we have? And what can you do with your tooling, with your threat intelligence, and with the limited resources that you have in order to turn your solutions into something that works for you and your team? So what we've started to do over here at BlackRock is to build out a better life cycle of what we're going to be doing with all this disparate information. So threat intelligence can come from internal sources, external sources, purple team activities that we run, some of the tabletop exercises that our team regularly goes through, current attacks and industry threats. It's good to have a combination of information that you are gathering from multiple sources because you are only as good as the information that you have. The more of it that you've got tailored to your own environment, fantastic. Sometimes getting information about things above and beyond your environment can help add into that as well. After we've got our threat intelligence, we obviously have alerts that our analysts are going to run through, triage, and take some various different actions on. We also have different alerting statuses. Some alerts might only be a notice that it has happened. Others are going to be more from a blocking perspective of this is something that's bad enough that we want to take action on. So a priority system as to how we're going to be managing this. Then after all of that, we go through what we call validation. Not only were these alerts accurate, did they do what they were expected to do? Can we make them better? What else can we do from this? Is there specific information that we could add into this alert to continue to improve it moving forward? The last thing that we add in is some reporting. So not only what was the status of these alerts that came through, but what are we going to do about them? How successful are we being over time? Is this process working that we have devised on how we are going to build out this life cycle? There we go. So what we basically want to start with is what do we know? Right? What do we know about our systems? How do we break down the information about all these different things that we have in our environment? How do they work? How does the data get from point A to point B all the way to your analyst's hands for them to actually take action on? So what we've done is we have to go and map out everything that we know. What are all the pieces of information that you have on your endpoint? What is all your threat intelligence that you have? What are the analytics, the forensics tools that you have available? And how does the event go from detection all the way into your or all the way into your SIEM or where your analysts are going to be actioning it? One of the challenges that we've typically run into is you get all these great tools. They're supposedly working straight out of the box. And how many times does that actually work? You have to go through customizations. You have to go through your default configurations. You have to figure out how that information is going to get from point A to point B, not only with all of your on-prem tools, but all the tools that are now with a cloud-based backend that you no longer control all of the aspects of these tools.
So Becca, you're essentially taking what you know about the attacker, your threat intel, and you are operationalizing it. It's threat intel in action to help you measure the efficacy of your security controls.
Exactly, because if you don't know from where you're starting, or if you don't have an idea of where you start, how can you do some of these measurements? How can you figure out exactly what the story is that you're trying to tell? So the way that we start to approach that is we've taken the MITRE ATT&CK matrix as a good place to start. Does this cover everything? Heck no. But is it a great place to start? Yes, but with limits. There is no way that my detections are ever going to be completely green across here. If I did, I'd wonder about how much money and time I'm spending on things that actually matter, because this is not going to be possible. What you need to do, though, is to basically figure out what matters to you. What matters to your tool stack? Everyone's tool stack is going to be slightly different. If you've got a tool that can go and identify where some of these attacks are coming in earlier on in the chain, maybe you don't need something as completely detailed as you had on the endpoint. Or maybe you do. But at least if you know where that gap is, that makes it a lot easier for you to either justify why you don't have something there right now, or to identify the attack in a different manner or method than before it even gets to there. So one of the things that we have started to do is to map out where we think each of our tools should be covering. What should they cover? This is the general space where they should be and what they should be giving us alerts based on. So then the next thing is great. We think we know with what we're starting at, we think we know where we are, but how do you actually know that? A lot of the problems that you have with the tool set that you are currently dealing with is you've probably never tested it completely from head to toe. You've never tested your endpoint and said, run all of these different attacks against it. You haven't run some of the attacks that the threat actors are trying to do through your environment. One of the things that we've got is with the managed validation platform, we have the ability to run threat actor scenarios through our entire tool set so we can know what our actual tool set, as well as the alerts, as well as the status of some of the detections that we have built, how are they actually working? Is this what the tool should be doing, or is there more things that we could be doing to basically make it better over time?
So you're creating a coverage map and saying, this is our hypothesis for what we believe we should be able to see or prevent or alert on. And then you're using the managed validation platform to determine what you actually have the ability to see or to alert on.
Correct. And you are hoping you don't find too many surprises along the way.
That's
because
right.
Those are the things that really kind of turn this into an interesting event.
Becca, I have a question for you. How much time would you say on a monthly or a quarterly basis is invested into that threat mapping exercise and reconciling what you have against where you think that your coverage is?
So right now, we basically have a team of 6 that's relatively dedicated to this process, and we kind of run it as a bit of an agile type of situation. So there's weekly meetings that are going on with everyone that is in this meeting to constantly reprioritize what we think that we're actually working on at any given point in time, because it's great that you think that these are your current priorities this week, and then another 0 day comes out and everyone's like, no, you need to focus over here. You need to tell us what's going on over here. So by having weekly touch points, usually multiple times during the week, we can continually reassess and figure out where we need to be spending our time and what we need to be prioritizing it all with. So some of the things that have come about from our regular testing have been entertaining, to say the least. One of the big things that I'm actually going to call out Greg, who's in the audience over here, who is part of our Mandiant team, has helped us identify, has been some NTP drift that we ended up finding on some of our appliances. And NTP is one that pretty much everyone kind of takes advantage of, and you expect it just to work until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, then all of a sudden you start to realize you have problems correlating all of your events at the end of the day. So by running regular tests, we are able to make sure that not only is our configurations correct, but that we are identifying any of these potential problems with just base level configurations that either we should have caught or things that have changed in our environment that potentially we were not aware of before. Another big find that we had was we had done a massive infrastructure changeover to a new provider for one of our services. Instead of those hosts now being on site, they had basically moved into the cloud. The way that that data was being ingested into our SIEM was creating delays of almost 90 minutes or more in just being able to get those logs into our SIEM. No one had noticed this. This had been up and running for a while. Again, our regular testing, we went looking for the events. We said, okay, we fired off this event. We know it should be here. Where the heck is it? And then finding it an hour and a half later, we were like, well, that's not supposed to be there. What happened? And what goes back into me basically saying, know your environment and know how your logs get from point A to point B, is we found that the actual issue was around the application that was supposed to be ingesting the logs from the cloud provider was getting overloaded. So it wasn't giving us that there were error messages so much on the log provider. The cloud provider said, oh, well, we're sending you the logs. Everything looks fine on our side. And we were just like, Well, we're not getting them, so there's clearly a backlog somewhere. We looked at network latency, we looked pretty much everywhere, ended up being a host-based problem with it not being able to spool off the events into multiple hyper-threading processes in order to be able to pass us the logs in time. How else we would have found that, I don't even know. So I'm really glad that we've got this testing platform in place that allows us to go down and identify exactly where within that logging stream we were actually having problems.
Becca, I'm curious, for on-prem only controls versus those controls that exist in the cloud, what were some of the key things that were different in diagnosing that issue and working through to remediation of those issues? Were there challenges that were unique to the cloud that you had to solve?
There are definitely some different ones. Because you don't control all of the infrastructure, you have to rely on your cloud providers in certain ways in order to get you some of the information. Whereas on-prem, if it's a networking issue, you can go to your networking team. If it's a host-based issue, you can go to the infrastructure team that's running and managing that. With the cloud-based platforms, there's a lot more collaboration that you have to do with your cloud providers in order to get the information that you're looking for. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to troubleshoot all the way down to the root of the issue. Yes, the issue that I went over was a cloud-based issue. What the problem was, though, was with the application that the vendor had that we had installed on-prem. So it was still, they didn't have full visibility into the problem. We didn't have full visibility into the problem. We had to work together to kind of go through all of the different steps and all the places that that log data existed on its way into our SIEM in order to be able to even figure out how we were basically losing this data from a time perspective.
So taking the evidence of time drift and then really partnering with your cloud providers, partnering with your security control providers, pulling everyone into a room and saying, let's get down to business, let's figure this out.
Exactly, and let's find a solution that works, because at the end of the day, that's part of the challenge that you run into with clouds, is everything's a bit of a hybrid solution, and figuring out the best way for your environment might be different from my environment. Other events that we've also gone through, specifically with the testing, has been around zero-day mapping. Everyone remembers Log4j, and everyone remembers the panic that followed as soon as that came out for 24, 48, 72 hours, where we're all like, well, we all have a problem, and what do we do about it? One of the nice things that our continuous testing has allowed us to do is we know where our gaps are. We know where our holes are. We know what we don't know, but we also know how our tools are currently responding in that space. So the more information that we have about the specific actor TTPs or the way that Log4j was able to execute, we could say, I might not have a signature or a detection built, but this is where I need to look, because I know that these tools are positioned in the right place to be looking at the specific events that we need to be identifying. That it might be a long slog if we've got to go digging through, some of those server logs or some of that network traffic, but at least we have an idea where to start. If we hadn't gone through and done all this mapping out previously, we wouldn't even have an idea of where to start at that point. So having that kind of baseline understanding and knowledge of where our tools are, which ones are doing well, and which ones we need to kind of focus a little bit more on, allow us, again, this goes back to that fast pivoting that we were talking about before, is we know these are where the gaps and the holes are. So rather than focus on some of these other detections that we were working on, we need to pivot to things that are actually going to matter for this particular event right now. Trending findings. Everyone loves charts and graphs and when they tell you things. What is always entertaining to me as we are going through these is how fast things can change in your environment. So the nice thing, and I think Greg put this extremely well the other day when we were talking, is that when you have static tests that you run constantly, when you know your infrastructure isn't changing, when there are deviations to the results that you are getting back from these tests, this is a great indication that something else has changed. Now, the question of what has changed might be something in your control. It might also be out of your control. So, for example, that big infrastructure change that I went through, or that I mentioned earlier, that is something that made a change in how our environment was reacting and responding to a lot of these things. We knew that this infrastructure change was happening. We had to react to it. But what I thought was also interesting is with our trending graphs, we were able to see how fast we were able to get back to normal. Anyone who's ever done an infrastructure deployment knows it's never as easy as planned. Things always basically go south, go sideways. Something doesn't work as advertised. The getting back to that normal state, this allowed us to map that out, tell the story, and be able to provide regular updates of how we were doing at renormalizing our infrastructure as well as our testing to make sure that we're still getting the coverage that we anticipated after that change. We've also seen different adjustments to some of our logging when, the networking team potentially makes a change we weren't expecting, or other events are going on that we're not fully expecting. When our events and our responses are changed, we know at least where to start to look. Because if my networking detection tools are fine, but it's my endpoint tools that are now showing me different results than what I'm currently expecting, or that are different from last week, having those known changes in those static environments can really kind of help pinpoint where you even need to start to take a look.
So you were able to use visibility trends to identify that a major infra change happened and essentially degraded the functionality of security controls in that environment.
For sure. And the great thing with this, and I think pretty much everyone would agree, is knowing your battles and knowing where your outages are is half the challenge that you have in order to even be able to address the problem. If we know we're in the middle of an infrastructure change or monitoring in certain areas is degraded, if you have an incident that's going on, you need to take that into an account. But if you didn't know that in the first place, you could spend additional hours on trying to figure out why this data isn't there, or why it's not working as expected, or why you can't find exactly what it is that you're looking for. Having a great idea of what your systems look like week over week and knowing where your problems are can really kind of simplify and speed up some of that incident response when you do have an event.
I'm curious to hear your opinion. In the absence of a validation platform like this that was doing continuous testing and providing that baselining, how long would you guess it would have taken someone to notice that those tools are degraded?
Oh, it depends who was asking.
That's fair. That's fair.
So it really kind of depends. Who's looking at the tools on a regular basis? Is the change enough that it was something that was noticeable or not? Because part of the challenge that you run into is sometimes your tools are operating in a degraded state and you don't know. Because what you're specifically looking at isn't something that's coming about from the way that you were basically looking at your tool previously. So the ability to run multiple different types of tests, I think, allows us a greater visibility to not only ensure that the logs are getting to where they need to be, but the alerts are working in the way that they need to be. And the alerts that are in the tool are the same alerts that are getting to the SIEM, that are the same alerts that are getting to the SOC. We're following that life cycle of where they were created all the way through to when someone actually needs to action on it. And if you're not following that entire life cycle, if bits and pieces in there are broken or degraded, you're obviously having an impact that you might not even be aware about.
Absolutely. Was the infrastructure team surprised at how fast you reached out to get unblocked?
You would. I'd say yes, but I have a feeling that they all have my name on speed dial for the first person to yell at when things go wrong as well. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. The other thing that we like to do is future planning, right? So we've kind of talked a little bit about some of the 0 days and how you can kind of plan your infrastructure and environment around being able to handle things in the future. But other things that we can also look at is how the threat actors are changing over time, right? It's not just there's a 0 day out here and how are we going to go and react and pivot to that. We can get into the Mandiant testing platform here and look at a variety of different types of things that are of interest to us and our team. Maybe it's specific TTPs that we've identified that threat actors are using against it. Maybe this is some of the outcomes of some of the phishing emails that we've seen over the previous week that have had more success than others. If we want to identify similar things that are along the same vein as tests or real-life attacks that we are currently seeing, having a platform that not only has a lot of these pre-canned attacks, but allows us to build our own is absolutely indispensable for us being able to basically stay on top or look into the future of different things that we can be protecting against. So one of the examples that we'll have above and beyond this is, I love this example from one of my analysts. We were working on detecting cobalt strike beacons. And we know how fast that those are basically coming out on a very regular basis. But one of the challenges that she asked the other day was, well, how do I know what the UID number is? Like, what do I know? I don't know enough about the range. We know from our experience that, We'll say number 3 and number 5, we have seen those specifically. We were able to reach back out to Mandiant and say, give us all the examples of Cobalt Strike that you've seen so that she could do some analysis and identify, well, is that 0 to 9? Is that 0 to 50? Is it 0 to 100? So that she could craft a better detection rule to figure out exactly what we were looking for. Then we were able to use the platform to basically run tests to validate that her rule that she'd written in order to be able to detect these was working as expected.
So you're using the platform to scale from a point-in-time red team or a point-in-time purple team exercise that's very narrow and very focused to something that's broader that covers many different iterations of a particular technique that you're hoping to address.
Absolutely. We all hate writing things from scratch.
Absolutely.
The more that we can reuse, recycle, and just continue to edit and adjust the things that we have, the less work it is for the analysts, the less work it is for us overall, and the more that the end result isn't changing. Because we know if Cobalt Strike is Cobalt Strike is Cobalt Strike, it doesn't matter what it looks like. Our same reaction as to finding Cobalt Strike is going to be what we do at the end. So there's no reason that we should have to go through and write 87 different Cobalt Strike rules to say this is this variant versus this variant versus this other variant. If we can kind of combine all that together into one rule, that's a lot more efficient for everyone because that's only one playbook that you have to write instead of 87 on the different things that you're going through.
Absolutely. I'm also curious, are you taking output from purple teams and red teams that may be custom to your environment, bringing them into the platform and using the platform to get scale of testing across different environments?
Absolutely. It's a great way of validating not only where were we at the last purple team or the last red team, but again, how the team has basically grown to detect that from the next one. So if we think we've got a detection that is going to work for some of the attacks that we have previously dealt with our purple team or our red team, this allows us the ability to make those custom tests in between those scheduled times where we can continue to include additional details that might have come up or threat actors that have changed some of their techniques that we know that we are going to ask the teams to basically handle for us moving forward. But being off that schedule allows us more flexibility within our own development cycles as well.
I love that. And one last question on this slide. You mentioned 0 days and Log4j. I'm sure a lot of us didn't sleep for several days during that event. What is your philosophy for how this platform allows you to be prepared for unknown unknowns that pop up like that?
Well, I wish my malware writing skills were a little bit better than they were because I would have tried to basically write my own, but I was too much in defense mode during those 3 days that was going on. But I will say that we were able to go through the library of a lot of the attacks that were already in here to look for similarities or to look for things that were going to be similar enough to that where we could see how our environment was going to respond. So this goes back to knowing your environment. If you have an idea of what those vectors look like, even if you only have the TTPs, to know the general idea of how these actors are going to be acting or responding, you can map some of the existing attacks that already exist within the platform and then run those tests to figure out how your abilities are going to be to respond to that. Whether you have the blocking capabilities, whether all you have is detection capabilities, whether you've got nothing, right? So this was a good kind of way for us to go through and be like, well, the endpoint logging that we needed on some of these hosts did not exist. And we could run some tests using Mandiant's platform to make sure that we had some of those logging sources turned up and ready to go as we were basically working through all this incident.
Perfect. Better visibility into post-exploitation.
Absolutely. So this is kind of what I was hinting at before with combining the Mandiant advantage. The nice thing that they have is a wide repository of malware, but also on top of that, they also have a wide repository of different threat actors that are out there. So what we can do is to prepare ourselves for the future. Now, how likely is it that this particular threat actor is going to come against us? I don't know. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But if at least I have a general idea, if I start seeing news that all of a sudden these guys are targeting financials that are a lot closer in style to me, I can already tell my CISOs and above, this is where we are. This is how we're protected. This is what we've seen that this particular threat actor can do Based on that, our stance is that this is how well we believe that we are protected. Again, are we going to have absolutely every single one of these things green? Heck no. But the more of these that we have, again, if this is a particular bad guy who's coming in, if they can trip some of the switches and I know where to look to find that particular person, or flip that around. If I'm seeing these particular tags coming out or these particular detections, and I know that that maps to this particular actor, that gives me a little bit better of a story to tell my management. My management kind of doesn't really care about a lot of the day-to-day stuff that's going on, but they need to know in general, how well are your tools performing? How well is your team prepared? And if we can put that into stories of these are the threat actors that are actively targeting us right now. These are the things that we should be concerned about. These are the ones where we are going to lose the money. This is where our risk is. And we can say this is how well we're protected against that. And they say, but what about these ones? You're not protected there. Okay, but we don't need to be because we've got this, this, and this. But if you have extra money, we can go find someone who will cover that. So it turns into an interesting conversation where you can actually have a better story with some of your executives about how you're prioritizing the risk based on the different threat actors that are potentially targeting you, looking at you. But this is almost an easier story to tell at the end of the day.
I love that. So having quick answers to are we protected against this threat that we just saw in the news, and also focusing on broad TTPs used by just about any attacker, regardless of attribution.
And the more of these that you look at, the more you start seeing some of those same similar techniques and tactics. So even as they mentioned earlier in the keynotes, where you might get actor one who's got actually the access into your systems, and then actor two comes along and has bought it off of actor one, and then actor three is the one that's actually in there. A lot of these TTPs are replicated between all of these different actors. So if you have visibility on some of the more common ones as to how they're getting in the first place, you can at least have an idea they're there before they get all the way to the exfiltration phase when you really have a problem. So some of the things that we do is regular brainstorm sessions. And so not only are we taking some of these top TTPs, as you mentioned, but we take a lot of different thoughts and ideas, and we put them kind of into a tracking system where we are trying to identify all of the things of interest. Yes, this is heavily redacted, and no, I don't apologize. These are basically the melting pot of ideas that our team has come up with to try and identify where are all the gaps that we see, where are all the problems that we have, or let's come up with just different ideas on how to attack all these different problems. Are some of these feasible? No, but we're going to say at least we thought about them, and we can put them in here. So if someone comes asking, we can say, this is the initial analysis that has been done on some of these particular items so that we can figure out, is this something that we even want to look at? So I know one of the examples that we were talking about the other day was SSL decryption. I would love to decrypt just about everything, aside from banking traffic and all the things that get you in trouble. But is that actually feasible? Probably not. But we can at least have a line item in here saying that we thought about it, we've considered some of the risks, and this is our current stance on that, whether or not it's something that is actually actionable. So the ability to kind of go through here, combine all these different pieces of information, whether it's a threat actor, whether it's a known issue within our environment, whether it's a tooling issue, whether it's a specific TTP, however it is, we want to make sure that we've got that tracked. So if someone comes in and asks us, we don't have to say, I don't know. We can say, we have thought about it, this is where we're currently at, and this is kind of our general stance as to where we are at the moment as to how we're actually going to be prioritizing that.
I love that. What are the key elements of a good detection catalog? What does good look like for you?
Oh, that's a loaded question. Having it completely done. No, just kidding. The ability to prioritize is really the big thing. So the more that you've got people who know your environment, that you're bringing in, that you're getting feedback from, the better this gets. My detection team does not operate in a vacuum. They are heavily tied into our SOC. They are tied into the teams that handle the purple team reports. They are tied into our threat intelligence team so that we can constantly get feedback to make sure that we're addressing the right problems. Just because you've got ideas on how to fix everything doesn't mean that every single one of those ideas is the right thing to be working on right now. So the more that we've got the extra feedback loop in of how well these things are working, how well it's doing in testing. One of the things we've run into has been that we're halfway through trying to make a detection on an alert, and we're just like, this is just not working. I've got way too many false positives, and I don't have enough information where I can tune that down enough where it's actually something that's going to be actionable. Saying that it doesn't work, or I can't do this right now, is still an okay example of things that we've basically tracked in here, of saying, this is as far as we got. If this is a big issue, we can come back to it, but we've tracked the status. We know like how far people have gotten on this so that we can always come back if that's something that we need to address again in the future.
Thanks for that.
So around some of the custom detections that we're ending up doing, one of the things that we've quickly run into along with everyone else is not every single tool is sufficient on its own. Combination of events from multiple tools can sometimes be a better indicator that something is going on rather than having to just rely on output from individual tools themselves. So one of the challenges that you run into with TTPs is threat actors might have 5 or 6 different TTPs. In order to get the alerts that are related to each one of those, you might be pulling from 3, 4, 5, 7 different sources of information to be able to actually make sure that you're getting the event you want. If your networking tool says this, your packet tool says this, and your endpoint tool says something different, there might be different combinations of those events that you can make higher fidelity alerts. You can also have some that you know are going to be noisy, and they are noisy because they are just a stepping stone until extra events happen that make those alerts all of a sudden much more concise. So looking at things just as, interesting items that are happening, looking at our VIPs and trying to be like, well, what custom things do our VIPs need than anything else? If we saw this going to someone in the mailroom, maybe that's not as interesting if that's going to our head of finance kind of thing. So having that additional context that we can wrap in here to be able to add our business-specific knowledge, our knowledge of our people, our knowledge of our tools, our knowledge of where our data is that we care about, to be able to customize these things above and beyond, and then run it through a testing platform, freaking awesome.
I love that. So if you smell fire, then your reaction might be different than if you smell fire and see smoke and it's getting hot in the room and the fire alarm is going off.
And if you don't have your fire extinguisher nearby, then you've
Right.
got even more of a problem, right? So knowing where that fire extinguisher is, knowing how you're going to attack the problem, and knowing how serious of the problem is based on how many of these indicators are going on. You can set up different tiering levels of, this is kind of a low priority one, this is a medium priority, this is a high priority, and they can all kind of interact off each other. But again, the more granular that you get, but also thinking about some items where you want to know every time a certain type of activity happens. But it's really only something of super interest when something else happens as well. The other thing that we do, is I've kind of hinted at this before, is that our detections don't automatically go from non-existence into pure production. We have a bit of a life cycle that everything goes through. So we start with our unassigned, and then it'll quickly move into our alpha phase once someone has decided to pick it up. And then from there, we've got all sorts of different testing phases that we go through. So not only is the alert working as expected, but then we've got to go through and do some validation. So this comes into where we'll use Mandiant Advantage for specific items. If we are looking for that Cobalt Strike Beacon, if we are looking for certain types of phishing emails that are out there, and we want to run it against our detections to see how well they're doing, to look and see if there's additional work that can be done to tune this up. You don't want an alert going into production that's got 5,000 events a day. You want that down into something more reasonable and much more manageable. So the more that you can make this manageable, the easier of a time that you're going to be, that your final output is something that can actually be used. And that's, again, why we've got the tie-ins with the SOC team as well as everyone else, because that might be something where the SOC is okay to take, 25 events a week if they know that that's about the expected one, knowing that it is a little bit more than normal, but if it's a real event, you really want to make sure that you kind of validated every single one of those.
Absolutely. Plan, do, check, act, and you're using security validation to check things, to
Exactly.
make sure that they're generating the data your SOC needs to be effective in their job.
And we're constantly trying to find ways of using it better, because with the flexibility of the platform, it allows us to build our own tests. It allows us to build things in a repeatable method that we can then automate. So there might be something that we want to do. We did some USB drive testing to make sure our endpoints were actually locking it down. You want to make sure that the tests that you have are something that's repeatable. So we literally have a USB drive plugged into a machine. We've got an automated action that tries to copy files onto the said USB and then copy them back out. But that's an automated test that we run after every patching cycle to make sure that nothing has broken some of these policies. You never know when something unexpected is going to happen that's going to break things. So the more of these different scenarios that you have for testing the policies and the controls that you think you have in place, the better chance that you're actually relatively on the right page of where you actually are really comes in handy. So some of the final thoughts. The continuous testing that we've gone through has really helped us kind of streamline and automate a large portion of what the detection team is currently working on. Now, there's obviously many, many ways that we can obviously do a lot more of that, but without a testing platform with the flexibility of what we currently have, we would not have even gotten to this point. The volume of things that have popped up, both expected as well as unexpected, have caused us to make some different decisions than maybe we were originally on the right path for. There's been a couple of different tools that we thought were working as expected, and the more time and effort that we spent on those particular tools and running through the tests, we're like, this is just not working in our environment. And we have actually decided to remove certain tools from our environment because they were not performing as expected. We have used this security validation testing to look at replacement products as well. Well, if we know that this is the in-house product, what happens if we bring in new products as well? We set them all up in a similar method so that they all should be receiving the same data, and then we can basically run our tests through and be like, well, this shiny object is supposedly better than our existing shiny object. Can I spend the money on this? Well, does it actually perform? And does it perform well, not over 5 tests, not over 10 tests, but let's do 200. Let's do 400 some odd tests. Let's get a really good idea of if this tool is actually better than the one that we currently have here in place, or what exactly we want to potentially do about that. Are we happy with what that tool is doing, or do we need to move on? Using Mandiant Advantage to get copies of different types of malware or asking them the hard questions about threat actors and TTPs has been extremely useful as well. Not only does our internal team do a lot of their own threat research on the different things that they are seeing on a regular basis, but trying to identify, well, what else? Because we might just be seeing one particular campaign from that particular actor, and they've probably done, who knows how many, right? The more information that we are able to gather, the better we are able to put together a response. So using the information that Mandiant has about some of these threat actors allows us to go a little bit more wide in some of those detections that we're building, rather than looking for a particular variant.
I love that you're using the tool to do bake-offs for security vendors that are bringing solutions to you, and focus on those areas where you have blind spots from the earlier mapping that you did. What would you say the impact to speed and velocity of making those types of decisions has been for you, having the ability to do it on a platform like this?
The ability to run multiple proof of concepts against each other all at the same time, rather than having to do one at a time and be like, okay, does this work? Does that work? Is it actually catching the things that we want it to do? The ability to crank out group POCs in like 2 weeks is absolutely phenomenal, because otherwise you're spending a lot of time trying to figure out, well, does it actually do the things that it says that are advertised? Does it actually not? When we can just run these tests through it on multiple tests per day and just kind of see exactly what are the responses coming back from it, it really gives you a good picture as to how you can have a good idea as to whether this product is a good fit for you or not.
I love that.
Last thing that we've got has even been standing up the new tooling. So I know I've kind of hinted at this before, but some of the new tools, getting you back to that base state. It's never a one-for-one swap out anytime that you're switching your tools off into something new. So this kind of goes back to those trending graphs of if we know how the current existing tool is performing, we're putting in a replacement tool from here, how long is it going to take us to get back to where we expected to be? How long is it going to take us as an organization to have our time of responses that we are currently accustomed to having back to where they were after we do this tool transition? So this has been a great way of having, like I said, that consistent base. You know where those threat actors are within your environment. You know how the testing platform is going to perform. And you can kind of see how this all adjusts over time.
I love that.
That's pretty much everything we've got for you guys.
Well, fantastic. Becca, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and speaking and for having me on stage. I think we do have 3 or 4 minutes left here at the end. Would love to open the room up for Q&A if anyone has any questions.
I scared everyone. Well, yes.
How are you using like Mandiant Advantage to not just for like the malware samples, but like for the profiles themselves? Is it mostly just with TTPs?
So it depends on so the question was how we're using Mandiant Advantage to get the threat actor information above and beyond just the TTPs. The TTPs are useful, but usually what we're interested in is, well, what are they actually doing? Just because they are targeting, say, the financial industry, does that mean that it's my particular type of finance? Is it retail banking? Where are they actually looking at? Was it just a spray and pray where we got lucky for this particular type of campaign that was coming out? There's a lot of information that goes into that, and I know my threat intel guys are watching me right now. There's a lot of information that we do of going into things that we have found on our network to try and get some more information about it. Because if we have found either malware or artifacts or interesting things here, we might not have the full picture of even what threat actor it is. So we might take that back to Mandiant and be like, well, what does this look like to you? This is our guess as to where it is, what it's doing, who's the person behind it, but we sometimes need a broader view of people that are not just our particular variants that we're getting. So yes, we can go out and be proactive and ask about people who are targeting our industry as well, but we can also say, we know we have a gap in this particular location. Are there any threat actors that are particularly looking for or have the capabilities of being able to get into my network in this way? And if they have to get all the way into here, what do they do in steps 1 through 5 so that I can detect them before they even get to that point?
And just one more.
Sure.
When you're preparing to like talk about gaps, is there a particular like framework they use? Like, are you gonna
Depends on the audience. So if you're talking about gaps, it depends on your audience. If I'm talking to my technical team, there's one way I will present it because they will understand I would go into the exact TTPs. We can talk about exactly why we are not seeing a particular log or a particular flow or a particular item that we could or would like to see. There could also be technical reasons why we're not getting that. Windows logs, great example. Tons of great information that's in there, but when you're starting to do that at scale, you kind of have to pick and choose which Windows events are actually of interest to you, because otherwise you're going to get overwhelmed.
I meant more like in reporting the gaps. Like, are you using a particular like I was thinking of MITRE, like mitigations, things like that. Like when you're talking about going to remediation and taking action, what are you using?
We will use MITRE to basically highlight some of the gaps, but the other thing that we've done, which would go well beyond the scope of this presentation, is what we've called like a gap analysis of our own tools, where we can basically analyze it in multiple different ways of saying, here's everything within, let's call it the networking space. These are all the tools that we currently have in here. Here's how we know that they're performing. Here is them mapped against the MITRE matrix. Here is them mapped against the volume of active alerts or detections that we have. Here are the known problems that we have that we know we're not able to deal with, such as the SSL decryption issue that I mentioned earlier. So again, we try and, you can't use just one, right? Because there's too many ways of looking at it. It's how much money are you spending on it versus the risk-reward gain that you have as well. So you have to take multiple different ways of looking at where your gaps are and what your problem is in order to tell the story. And that's why I said it also kind of goes back to your audience of if you're trying to explain that to your CISO, yes, we have this gap here. Is it worth $4 million to fix it? Probably not.
Thanks, Becca. Looks like we're at time. Becca and I will be here to do Q&A. If anyone has any additional questions, happy to help out. But let's give a round of applause for Becca.
Thanks, everyone.